Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 has been killed and resurrected like a true vampire, and it has as much appeal as a real dead body walking around, according to our review. What happened to get to this point? Instead of focusing on our review of the disastrous action RPG, which you can watch on the channel right now, I have a shovel in hand and I'm about to go gravedigger on the development secrets that have come to light over the years. Why did Paradox fire one of the only people attached to the original game and then fire Hardsuit Labs? How did the Chinese room come to develop the game? And why does Paradox infer that after all this, they are never making another RPG again? This is the messy history of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines came out in 2004, based on the gothic TTRPG from the World of Darkness system. There were tons of issues with the Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines launch. It was basically broken on release and was never officially fixed. All of the fixes that you can get nowadays were made by volunteers. It was an absolute mess. For example, there were even typos in the Chinatown dialogue. And at the end of all of it, the most basic of fixes was not made by Troika Games. Eurogamer's own review, written in 2005, notes animation flickers and textures going wrong, reloading and finding that a simple action has broken some of the level scripting, or getting caught in a game-ending crash bug upon exiting a mandatory mission, as well as the game eating up virtual memory, leading to increasingly lengthy load times, slower frame rates, and crashes. In 2015, Paradox enters stage left, snapping up White Wolf, who own the World of Darkness IP, Vampire the Masquerade being part of that world. At the time, Paradox wanted to expand into new genres. Later, in 2024, Henrik Feyroos, Chief Creative Officer, would say that Bloodlines 2 came from an older strategy to expand into new genres, namely RPGs. This strategy was one they abandoned fairly quickly once it got into the 2020s. In 2015, Hardsuit Labs start working on Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 in secret. Expectations were high for the sequel, at first. Paradox were flaunting the sequel and their ownership of Vampire the Masquerade, with Paradox interactive producer Christian Schlutter going as far as to say that the Bloodlines IP was the crown jewel. In the dictionary definition of irony, Paradox was originally planning to hold off on Bloodlines 2 because they wanted to do it right, until Hardsuit Labs came along with, quote, the perfect pitch. Pitching for the Bloodlines 2 IP is a pattern in the development of the game. Evidently, developers have strong feelings about Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, strong enough to go to bat for it, and I wonder if there was some kind of allure to having the sequel to Bloodlines attached to your studio. Brian Mitsoda was part of the pitch and Hardsuit Labs team, adding some lustre to their work on the sequel. Having been the head designer of Bloodlines at developer Troika Games, he worked alongside Kara Ellison, of Void Bastards fame, to write Bloodlines 2. But, despite his history with Bloodlines, Mitsoda admitted that working on the game was daunting. In fact, he said this in the same breath as revealing that Hardsuit Labs had their sights set on Bloodlines 2 as soon as they heard that Paradox had bought the World of Darkness IP. A continuing pattern of developers slicing more veins than they could drain is a subtle undercurrent in this saga, of the siren song of Bloodlines 2 and its potential for glory, overwhelming any pragmatism that certain studios should have bore in mind. On March 22nd, 2019, Bloodlines 2 was announced at GDC and was said to be coming to PC and consoles in 2020, and journalists got hands-on with a demo. This now mythical demo would explore the original story of Bloodlines 2. It was set in modern-day Seattle, and you were playing a thin-blood vampire recently turned as a result of the mass embrace in which a group of rogue vampires attacked humans. At the beginning, you don't choose your clan, but instead are offered the choice between 3 starting abilities. Nebulation granted you the ability to turn into mist, Mentalism allowed you to manipulate objects from afar, while Chiropteron lets you defy gravity and glide through the air. Bloodlines 2 originally centered on the idea that you are very much what you eat. Stalk out some prey and you can see how characters have different hues and resonances tied into their emotional state. Feed on someone who's angry and you'll consume that anger too, leading to temporary perks. Constantly feed on people of a certain emotion and you get access to more permanent buffs. This story would be a sticking point later on, when the Chinese room took over development. Future clans were planned to be added post-release to the original pitch, though they were going to be free updates. Just put a pin in that. Hardsuit Labs had high expectations from the very beginning. One favour the tumultuous launch of Bloodlines did for Hardsuit was to pinpoint where players felt shortchanged and what needed to improve. The biggest amongst them, a smooth launch and thus a technically finessed game on day one. No bugs, no crashes, no typos. Quite a tall order for a studio that didn't have any experience in RPGs, as will become clear years later. Mitsoda identified the tone of Bloodlines being something the studio wanted to distance themselves from. As he put it when talking about the game in 2019, shortly after development was announced, he said, "It's 2019 now, we have to update the tone and we're not going to make a 2004 game in 2019. We're going to approach subjects a little differently and with a lot more research and respect than was done back then." Mitsoda wanted to distance Bloodlines 2 narrative and world from the content of the first game with, as he puts it, more research and respect. And yet, he said all that while avoiding taking any accountability for his own part in portraying negative stereotypes or even addressing them in the first place. Now, while I'm of course not suggesting that Mitsoda was the sole person working on Bloodlines, so of course he'd use the word we, he was the head designer on Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. This makes him very hard to separate from Bloodlines and its undeniable problem with race. Corinne Bay wrote an incisive article for The Gamer about Bloodlines' treatment of race titled "Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines Had Problems with Racism," which explores its harmful depiction of people of colour like Skelter and Ming Zhao. So the female characters who boobed boobily every which way, Jeanette's troubling DID characterisation, and the game's racist depiction of people of colour must have been under Mitsoda's purview, so surely he was the one who gave those depictions the green light. I recommend reading Bay's full piece, not only because we can't allow Bloodlines to be viewed with rose-coloured nostalgia goggles when it has numerous problems, but also because it may lend some insight into later drama, namely context around Paradox's desire to distance themselves from the reputation of the original Bloodlines. Behind the scenes, stuff was getting messy, and the first delay arrived, pushing the game back to later in 2020. A joint statement from developer Hardsuit Labs, Andy Kipling and Brian Mitsoda, read that they decided to value quality over making the Q1 launch window. The statement made it clear that developers wanted to avoid the technical issues that had plagued the first game, which famously launched too early, but that wasn't the whole truth, as we would come to find out years later. Once again, it was delayed, this time in August 2020 to 2021. Kipling and Jacob Munther, boss of role-playing games at Paradox, said the game needed more time to ensure the best player experience possible. This second delay solidifies that one of the main things Paradox was concerned about was the game's ability to run smoothly, which apparently Hardsuit Labs was having a hard time delivering on, amongst other concerns. The statement also mentions organisational changes, although it does not elaborate. This would not bode well. Sure enough, 8 days later, it was announced that Brian Mitsoda and Kai Clooney had been fired. The decision came as a shock to Mitsoda. He said that he had never been led to believe that he hadn't succeeded in his role. Mitsoda's involvement in the original game had helped to lend credibility to the sequel among longtime fans, so his dismissal was a blow for those excited about the game's release. Paradox and Hardsuit Labs said that it was a joint decision between developer and publisher, thanking Mitsoda and Clooney for establishing the game's storyline and dark tone, and helping to ensure that they were making a true successor to the original Bloodlines. 2 months later in October, Cara Ellison, senior narrative designer, left. Another nail in the coffin. The omens started to congregate when, on January the 7th, speaking to Swedish financial publication Placera, Paradox CEO Ebbe Ljungerud said that "I do not think Bloodlines 2 will come in the first half of the year, but we will see." According to the article, Paradox's decision to adapt the game for the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, as well as staff exits and the pandemic, all contributed to the delay. Ljungerud cited the lack of development kits from Sony and Microsoft as a key component in his hesitation to be firm on a release date. There was clearly more going on behind the scenes though, and more than Ljungerud was ever going to say publicly, because on February the 23rd, Paradox halted development of Bloodlines 2 from Hardsuit Labs, delayed the game indefinitely, and cancelled new pre-orders. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, as we, and Hardsuit Labs, had known it, was dead. This decision was greeted with shock by the gaming industry. In a rather frank statement, Paradox said that Hardsuit Labs had, if I'm being harsh, basically not done a good enough job to merit finishing the game with them. I'll justify that remark in 3 sentences, so just hold on. The statement read, in part, "We have made the decision that Hardsuit Labs will no longer be leading the development of Bloodlines 2. In order to meet our goals for the game, we've come to the conclusion that a change is needed and, as a result, more development time is required." Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 wasn't gone for long. Ljungerud confirmed during a quarterly earnings call that an unnamed new studio had already been hired to finish work on the game, and so the uncanny, not quite Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 showed up on our doorstep. When I was writing the script, I was haunted by one thought. What happened to make Paradox unceremoniously fire Hardsuit Labs? It seemed cold. I mean, it is business, but still. I was desperate to find out why, so I hunted through dozens of interviews to find any kind of shade thrown which might indicate why they were taken off development. And I was successful. In 2024, Deputy CEO Matthias Lilja told PC Gamer that the cancelling of Bloodlines 2 seemed inevitable until the Chinese room came along. He said, crucially, that they could not continue working as we did, implying that whatever build of Bloodlines 2 Hardsuit Labs was working on wasn't up to par and wasn't ever going to be. In Paradox's eyes, that is. An interview with Rock Paper Shotgun in 2024 shed light on why that was. Lilja said that, quote, "With Hardsuit Labs we agreed on a vision of what they were going to make, and they had a problem delivering on that. Both developer and publisher agreed that Hardsuit Labs wasn't the suitable developer going forward, and Bloodlines 2 was put temporarily on hiatus." Lilja also told GamesIndustry.biz in 2024 that "We thought we had a game we could do, but maybe not with the team we had." So it appears that Hardsuit Labs told Paradox they were struggling, which wouldn't be a surprise because just listen to what Lilja says next. Hardsuit Labs has many qualities, but they've never done something on this scale, so they were basically building the team as they were building the game, and that turned out to be very tough, and they were not shy to say so. It sounds like Bloodlines 2, 1, wasn't ready even with the delays, 2, was too ambitious for Hardsuit Labs who had to build a team at the same time as making the game, and 3, Paradox did not want a repeat of the mess of the original Bloodlines launch. It sounds like Hardsuit Labs were honest with Paradox about them having a hard time developing the game, so Paradox, bearing all of this in mind, killed Bloodlines 2. In hindsight, development might have been doomed from the very beginning. At the time of Bloodlines 2's announcement, Hardsuit Labs had only worked on Blacklight Retribution, a free-to-play arena shooter FPS in a cyberpunk future, a far cry from an RPG, let alone an urban vampire RPG. While game studios don't have to be familiar or have a past with the genre they're pitching, just look at Horizon Zero Dawn coming from Killzone developer Guerrilla, the lack of technological architecture to create a role-playing game with deep systems, a dense world, and different combat, along with a dearth of institutional know-how, is a colossal obstacle to overcome, especially when you're hiring people at the same time as developing a game. Just thinking of the onboarding you'd need to do month to month makes me incredibly anxious. Anyway, behind the scenes, the Chinese Room had pitched their version of Bloodlines 2 and were given the vision for the game and what Hardsuit Labs had made, with the freedom to change or remove whatever they didn't like. What we got to play in 2025 was a husk of the original concept, but you can find vague shadows of the old demo, like a shadow of the "you are what you eat" approach found in NPCs having melancholic, choleric, and sanguine resonances in their blood, but with far shallower effects. Years later, Lilia would note that the appeal of the Chinese Room was due to them being a more stable developer, meaning that they could approach Bloodlines 2 with more confidence, and that their pitch saved the game from being cancelled entirely. But now, in hindsight, maybe that cancellation would have been for the best. A month after Hardsuit Labs and Paradox went their separate ways, some scant information emerged about the status of Bloodlines 2. As part of its Q3 interim report, Paradox said it was happy with the progress of Bloodlines 2 under its new developer, but they still wouldn't reveal the name of the studio until 2 years later. CFO Alexander Brecker said this was because they didn't want the Chinese Room to have to address fans reaching out to them. Jumping forward to 2023, the year saw Paradox Interactive cutting any remaining ties between themselves and Hardsuit Labs, as they sold the shares they had bought in 2018 to Keyword Studios. Things began to move again in September when it was publicly announced, at last, that the Chinese Room was developing Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. The team behind Still Wakes the Deep and Everyone's Gone to the Rapture. Cue happy but a bit hesitant clapping, as although the Chinese Room had undoubted narrative ability, they hadn't ever tackled an RPG like Bloodlines 2 before. But hey, optimism prevails, and at that point, we still thought Bloodlines 2 was going to be an RPG. The aim was for Bloodlines 2 to release in late 2024, with the Chinese Room saying that Bloodlines 2 is their most ambitious project to date, reassuring fans that they are up to the challenge and are creating a game that honours the legacy of its predecessor while bringing its gameplay to the modern era. Paradox, on their own website, said that after the Chinese Room joined the project in January 2021, they were immediately blown away by their storytelling and design innovation and, quote, "Since then, they've surpassed all of our expectations and developed a Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines video game worthy of the 2020s. Behind the scenes, the Chinese Room found itself leaning into RPG tropes when designing Bloodlines 2's non-combat gameplay. Find a keycard to open a door, turn on a generator to restore power to a lift, etc., but ultimately introduced a rule that the game should contain something only a vampire could do, to keep it aspirational. This led them at first to a Dishonored-style framework where players would be more cautious when approaching encounters with enemies, but ended up realising that it didn't feel right for a vampire, as they envisaged vampires stalking their prey and striking fearlessly like a predator. An interview with PC Gamer revealed that the Chinese Room had reused a significant amount of art and level design from Hardsuit's project, and creative director Alex Skidmore clarified that this included a new codebase with different gameplay mechanics and RPG systems, effectively using the shell of what Hardsuit Labs had built. A tiny wisp of shade was thrown in this interview, allegedly, according to me. Skidmore said that although originally Bloodlines 2 was meant to centre around a thin-blood vampire, the Chinese Room didn't want it to be just a sort of poor homage or pastiche of Bloodlines 1. We wanted it to be its own thing. To me, that doesn't sound like the Chinese Room had a lot of time for Hardsuit Labs' pitch for Bloodlines 2. Instead of replaying the broad storyline of the first game, baby vampire gets familiar with the world, Bloodlines 2 Under the Chinese Room starts with an elder vampire to give players a different experience and the fantasy of being supremely powerful, while also, presumably, distancing the Chinese Room's Bloodlines 2 from any comparison between the original and the mythological build Hardsuit Labs built, Paradox played, and Paradox evidently didn't have much faith in. 2024 saw another delay, pushing back Bloodlines 2 to 2025. But hey, what's a year when the release date is 5 years out of date already? Something I find quite funny in a dark kind of way is how this entire faff with Bloodlines 2 appears to have given Paradox something like a phobia of developing RPGs, like ever again. In October 2024, Lilia told PC Gamer that this is it for them. "It's not in our strategic direction to make this kind of game," he said, so if Bloodlines 2, God willing, is successful, Bloodlines 3 will be done by someone else on the license from us. Bloodlines 2 is all that remains of a strategic direction Paradox was pursuing way back in 2014 when it bought the IP. Lilia was refreshingly, if surprisingly, blunt and straight up said that Bloodlines 2 does not have a long shelf life, that they expected an influx of players, a bit of word of mouth, and a high peak, with gameplay that doesn't develop over time, and then interest will trail off. So although Paradox expected Bloodlines 2 to recover its investment, Lilia said that if Paradox made any more RPGs, they should consider, quote, "how to invest when we're not sure that we exactly know what we're doing. That is one hell of a self-report." Paradox are now chasing strategy and simulation franchises like Crusader Kings and City Skylines, games that can have packs rolled out over the years just like Sims. Just take a look at their website and you can see how many editions you can buy for any one standalone game. RPGs, however, are broadly one and done. Maybe a DLC, but certainly not anything close to the scope of something like Crusader Kings. Paradox started to temper expectations in August 2025, taking to calling Bloodlines 2 a spiritual successor to Bloodlines. Now tell me in the comments, how does that make you feel now the game is out? In August, paid clans were announced and then removed in the form of the Toreador and La Sombra clans, and after outrage overwhelmed any and every conversation about Bloodlines 2 locking two of the most favoured clans behind a DLC, they were added to the base game. And then, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 finally came out. So now Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 is out, you can judge for yourself whether this history resulted in something worth all of that mess. I can't summarise my thoughts on it any better than Bertie Purchase, who reviewed it for us here at Eurogamer, when he said, "It feels like a game that's been stitched together for the sake of getting it done, so everyone, including perhaps us, can move on." If you like this video, please like this video and subscribe to Eurogamer for more videos about video games and retrospectives like these from me, Zoe Delahunty Light. And now I am going to go and watch a video on the relationship between Twilight and Mormonism because vampires? So I'll see you folks next time.